The games have just begun.
The Saw series just might be the most convoluted series of horror cinema's history. What started as a small, independent concept film by New Zealand filmmakers James Wan and Lee Whannell led not only to their future careers, but also a long-standing franchise with memorable characters, 3D, and blood. Lots and lots of blood. For all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer, and welcome to OverReview, a brand new series that I'm starting in the up-and-coming Halloween season to get something fresh, something new under my sleeves. Oh, it's not there. But it's here! Here it is! This is a very casual show where essentially I'm going to be both doing an overview and a review. See, hence the OverReview names. Yeah, clever. I'm going to be doing an over-review of an entire franchise, where usually I'll do a movie review of one film. In these videos, I'm going to be talking about an entire franchise. So, as you'll see, the runtime is going to be a little lengthy on these videos, but this is a very chill video. Think of it almost like a podcast where I can really dive in to each film in a series. I have several planned, but today we are talking about Saw, which is a series that began in 2004 and continues until this day with the up-and-coming film Spiral, set to be in theaters next year. Even though it was supposed to come out this year, of course, the Rona kind of had its way with our beloved franchise. But here we are, talking about Saw. Now, Saw is a weird case study in the world of horror because it's a series that has immense popularity and pop culture significance, but a lot of people bash the movies or straight up haven't seen them, which is sad. And I'll be honest, when I wanted to watch the original Saw, that took a lot of motivation on my end because I did not want to watch the Saw movies. I never had an inclination to watch these films. I always thought they were over-the-top gore and torture porn and gross and too disturbing. And I'm not really, despite my suit and despite my, the emphasis of my entire channel in loving horror films, I'm not really into blood and guts for the sake of blood and guts. I'd like to have a point, and I thought these movies were nothing but gratuitous violence, which is not the case. Not for all of them. Some of the Saw movies, yeah, we'll get to that. But the Saw series has a very interesting way that each film is presented, in the sense that they're cookie cutter in a way where each one you can tell what's going to happen. And basically you have three kind of plots of each Saw film. And they vary in significance depending on the movie. But essentially there's like an A, B, and C plot where one of them is the actual traps of the Jigsaw killer, or killers, whoever they are. Kind of spoilery there. But you have the plot of the traps themselves. Then you have the actual killer's plot, and in the later ones especially, you see kind of the behind the scenes of how these killers make the traps and everything like that. And then you also have the CSI, the FBI, kind of the feds investigation, the cops, and how the cops deal with the situations of the killers and of the traps. And those three plots kind of make up each Saw film, as you'll see as we move forward. But we need to start at the very beginning. Like I said, James Wan, who's a very popular filmmaker now, he's been in the business since Saw in 2004. Him and Lee Whannell were New Zealand indie filmmakers who wanted to make a full-length horror film. And what they did is they shot a very simple concept film called Saw, and to fans it's called Saw.5. You can watch it on YouTube here. It's available in some of the DVD featurettes or Blu-ray features of a lot of Saw movies. Essentially, it's like a 10-minute concept short film of the bear trap scene where Lee Winnell is in the bear trap, and Jigsaw, the Billy puppet, appears with a little hat, and he has a New Zealand, Australian accent, and it's kind of funny. But it's a really interesting concept for a short film, and they pitched that to producers, and the producers wound up taking that and making it into a film, which was Saw, which was filmed on the cheap. And the reason it was so cheap is because the entire basis of the story revolves around two guys being stuck in one location, and then from there, you know, James and Lee had to figure out, well, why are they there in the first place? And that's what created the tension. It's a very Hitchcocky idea when you think about it, of the limited knowledge that the characters have, and then they have to branch off and discover the truth for themselves. And the original Saw is easily one of my favorite horror films. I think it nails almost every beat, from the suspense to the right amount of gore, to the music, to the great twist at the end. The performances, well, you know, they didn't get give the best performances, I guess. They're fine for this film. I guess the standout is Tobin Bell's voice, because he's really not in the movie all that much, but him as Jigsaw is throughout all of these movies, and he becomes the benchmark for the Saw experience. And I would recommend starting with Saw. I recommend just watching these in order if you're going to watch all of them, because frankly, they get very confusing, and even having seen all of them in sequential order still doesn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes, and you're often wondering, well, how does this get to here? I'm very confused, and I don't blame you. But the first Saw, very straightforward. It's essentially two guys, Dr. Gordon and Adam. One's a doctor, hence the title of Dr. Gordon, and Adam, who is a photographer, and they're in this, it looks like the Taco Bell bathroom, and they have to survive the deadly game of the Jigsaw Killer, who basically uses morality against you. If you're not appreciating your own life, then you will be punished. And that's exactly what both of these characters go through. It's a really character-driven movie, and I like that a lot, that it wasn't just unnecessary gore and violence, but there's actually a point to all of it. And it's an excellent film with a really great twist. And I want to say this, going forward, spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled for any of the Saw films, stop this video, watch the Saw movies, then come back and we can, you know, continue to talk about the Saw series, because it's quite a fascinating lore to follow. But the first one sets up everything. The Jigsaw Killer is none other than John Kramer, who's a man who was diagnosed with cancer, and in Saw 2 you figure out tries to kill himself and has a new outlook on life. But of course, as the series progresses, you learn more and more about Jigsaw's character and his mentality for things. And some of that is explored in Saw 4 very well and in Saw 5. But sticking with the basics, Saw 1 does everything right. And I would say it's the only one of these movies that is its own film by itself, because all of the other ones rely on the other films, and this one was its own thing. There were no sequels planned. The popularity of this film, of course, made it necessary for sequels to be produced, but at the time of this, James Wan and Lee Winnell were not making a franchise. They were making one film, and we're going to move on. And they produced the second film, and then from there on out, they really weren't a part of the series. But in fact, Darren Lynn Bousman took over for a lot of the sequels beginning in Saw 2. And what's crazy to think is that they're made in such a rapid turnover that each one came out the following year. So Saw came out in 2004, Saw 2, 2005, Saw 3, 2006, etc., etc. The only exception is the jump from Saw 7, Saw 3D, to Jigsaw, which was a gap from 2010 to 2017, because Jigsaw is kind of a reimagining of the series, and the same will be said for Spiral when it eventually hits theaters in 2021. So Saw 2 Stars Donnie Wahlberg, who I think does a great job in the movie. He plays a cop discovering Jigsaw. He catches him. He's got him. And you learn a lot about Jigsaw's backstory in this one. And I think it's a necessary one to understand what Jigsaw's about. In the first Saw, you really don't get to see him all that much doing what he does. But in the second movie, he really gets to toy with Donnie Wahlberg and mess with him. And you kind of get to learn about his past. You learn about his suicide attempt and the cancer and his philosophy on things. It's almost a religious sensibility, I guess. And the main story is a group of people in this house all inhaling the same toxin, and if they don't get the antidotes, then they will be locked in there and will die, basically. And one of the people in the house, of course, is Donnie Wahlberg's son. And the big twist at the end, like I said, you know, spoilers from here on out, is that Donnie Wahlberg's son is actually safe, literally in a safe, which was a very clever play. He's literally safe in a safe. And the actual game happened previously, before the events of the movie, and Amanda, who was in the first film a part of the bear trap, the infamous bear trap scene, was actually helping Jigsaw the entire time. This is a plot trope that will be used to death with the Saw series, both the manipulation of the timeline and also the inclusion of new helpers with the Jigsaw cases, even up until Jigsaw, where they explain that the new guy has been a part of this the entire time, even though he's never mentioned once in any of the other movies. It makes no sense. You have to take the chronological nature of the Saw films with a grain of salt, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Saw 2 is my second favorite Saw film, because it builds upon the first with the lore, and gives a unique story with its own twist. I didn't think Amanda was as strong of a character in this one, because she has to play the villain, and I don't think the actress does as good in that role. Not that she's a bad actress, because she's fine in the first film, but when she has this new dynamic to the character, I didn't like it as much. The traps are interesting enough, and it's again more about the psychological aspects of Jigsaw's game rather than the gore, which would kind of be changed in Saw 3. Which Saw 3 is one of my least favorites of the series. Not terrible, but it's not great. The plot sounds like it should be really good. It's about a father whose son was hit by a drunk driver, and he wants revenge, and Jigsaw is trying to teach him about how seeking vengeance is wrong, and he has to forgive. And it's just a fine message. But the traps are so over the top and don't make sense. The funniest trap is a woman hung in a freezer locker room with water being sprayed on her like every 20 seconds or something. And the main guy goes into another room, comes back, and she's a complete block of ice, completely frozen. It makes no sense at all, but it's so funny. But the B plot, I guess, of this one revolves around Jigsaw needing to get brain surgery by a surgeon woman who is sworn to help with Amanda's help. I don't like that plot as much, and of course Jigsaw is setting up stuff for the future movies because they knew they were going to make this into a huge franchise, and oh, big whoop-de-doo, Jigsaw plays him again because he swallows a tape that will be used in the fourth film, and yada yada yada. It's a fine attempt at, at a Saw movie, but after the first two, this one is a big dip in story quality, which does get improved in Saw 4, I think. Now, Saw 4 has a lot of flashbacks. The majority of this movie is flashbacks about Jigsaw, John Kramer, and his wife, who has a miscarriage, and then John tries to help by getting the guy who was responsible and teaching him about how to appreciate life and, you know, yada yada yada, all that stuff. His first trap, essentially. But it's hard to tell which trap is his first because they're always retconning this stuff and being like, no, this was his first attempt. No, this. And they do that a lot in Jigsaw and, you know, a few other movies. But Jigsaw has to teach this guy his lesson, whatever, and his wife had a miscarriage. Very sad story. And you kind of learn more than about what Jigsaw's rationale is when you understand his troubled history. On top of that, the main story, which I think is more fascinating than some of the other ones, is a cop who has to play Jigsaw, essentially, and deliver traps to people around the city, which is a fine premise. I like that all, like, there's a rapist that he ties up in a hotel, and then he goes to, like, a warehouse and does stuff. So there's a lot of dynamics there, but the issue is his whole lesson doesn't make any sense. His lesson, like, the thing he's supposed to learn is that it's not good to help people, like, to go through doors and help people, because he went through an unsecured door, and I guess it's supposed to be he was risky, but he's trying to save people's lives, so I get where he's coming from, and I didn't quite get the moral lesson. Like, most of the other Saw movies have a very simple, like, oh, you lied to people, or you were a drug addict, and you didn't appreciate your life. But here, this cop is just trying to help people, and Jigsaw's like, no, you gotta go through this game. So, a weird premise. I like most of the movie. The flashbacks are fine. The whole him going around the town, I thought was a really good idea, because most of the Saw movies are in one place. But, it could have been stronger. They bring back Donnie Wahlberg in this one, to kind of wrap up his little character story thing that they had going on. And they also, as you'll notice, keep bringing Jigsaw back because they want Tobin Bell to play John in all of these movies. So even though he dies in the third one, he is well throughout the entire series. So don't feel bad if you miss him after Saw 3, because, yep, he dies, he gets his throat slit, and that's the end of John Kramer. Saw 5... however, you know, opposed to Saw 3 and some of the issues I had with Saw 4. Saw 5 is my third favorite of the series. Sometimes I say it might be better than Saw 2. I don't really know fully. I wish I could mix Saw 4 and Saw 5 because there's elements that I like in either or, but Saw 5 is pretty good. It dives more into Hoffman's character, who was introduced in, I want to say he was introduced in Saw 3, and revealed to be kind of a part of everything in Saw 4, kind of the new Jigsaw. He's the guy pulling all the strings at this point. He's an agent that kind of goes rogue and does his own thing, but you learn about his backstory in this one, and I liked his backstory. His sister was murdered and raped, I believe, and he takes revenge in the guise of being Jigsaw. And Jigsaw, of course, is offended by this, abducts him, and teaches him the ways of how to be a Jigsaw disciple, if you will. And from then on out, he works with Jigsaw and does all these traps. And the main like plot element of the story is a group of people who are involved in some kind of murder scheme, where they winded up killing a group of people in this building. It was like a real estate scheme, and they all have to work together to survive the trap, but of course they don't get along very well, and it leads to hostility, and it leads to them causing each other to die. And I like that element of it. I feel like they got too angry at each other too quickly and killed each other off, but overall I really like the movie. Saw 5 is most similar to Jigsaw with that main storyline, but it's the backstory to Hoffman and how Jigsaw persuades Hoffman to be a Jigsaw disciple that I think was the most interesting part of Saw 5. Saw 6 is kind of middle of the road for me in terms of the Saw experience. I really like the trap stuff in this movie. Some of the cop stuff gets a little boring, but with Hoffman and his dynamic, you kind of learn a little bit more about him, and I think it makes it more worth it. Saw 6 is about a guy who is a health insurance, I don't really know what you call it, salesman. He sells health insurance and denies Jigsaw coverage. This was during, around 2007, 2008, when that was a hot topic. This is a more politically motivated film. Jigsaw, of course, gets Hoffman to abduct this guy and takes him through various traps, showing him why you cannot deny people of their lives because it's too hard of a choice to make. And you see that throughout the movie. There's a really psychologically tormenting scene with it's the shotgun carousel trap, where a group of his associates are spinning on a carousel and he must choose who to give mercy to. And of course, different characters are yelling out that they're pregnant or they got this going on, they gotta help whoever. There's another scene that stands out to me where there's an older woman who has a family and a younger guy who has no family, and Jigsaw's like, according to your coverage standards, you should prefer the young guy because he's healthier, more inclined to live, but the older woman has a family to leave behind. And it's that moral obligation and dilemma that I think's really good in Saw 6. Now, of course, some of the other side stuff with Hoffman and Jigsaw's wife gets a little repetitive and gets kind of old. Like, okay, bring me back to the traps now. I want to see how this is going to end. But it sucks you out of the experience. But it's still a good movie. I'd say it's mid-range. I would say if I had to rank them thus far, it'd probably be Saw 1, Saw 2, Saw 5, Saw 4, and then Saw 6, maybe. And Saw 6, like I said, sometimes it's better in certain scenes, sometimes it's worse, but overall it's a good experience. The ending has a nice twist to it, and you have a setup for what would be explained in Saw 7 between Jigsaw's wife and Hoffman and kind of their aggravation towards one another. Saw 7 is my least favorite in the series, and it's not a bad... It's really hard to explain Saw 7. It's not terrible. It's entertaining. But it's exactly what Saw should not be, all in its own movie. It's over the top, too much emphasis on the gore, and just having ridiculous amounts of violence for the sake of violence, and it really lacks on some of the story and building up suspense. It just kind of gives it all at once. But essentially, this movie reintroduces Dr. Gordon from the original film. There is like an AA meeting, like a therapy group session meeting for Jigsaw survivors, including one man who wrote a book on it, very popular author who's now in the media as a Jigsaw survivor. But Jigsaw, of course, knows that he lied and never was a part of a trap, which then makes him get into a trap where he has to recount and do everything that he said he did in his book, which includes putting hooks through his pectoral muscles and pulling himself up, which I don't know why he just didn't put his feet on the hooks and climb up. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's a Saw movie. Yeah, you can't follow everything. I feel like when they introduced Dr. Gordon, you knew what was going to happen with the twist that he's been a part of this the whole time, helping Jigsaw with the surgeries and everything like that. Okay. But I feel like they could have done it in a more clever way, in a more suspenseful way. I like the plot of this guy being an author and lying, and I feel like they could have done more with the whole aspect of this circle of people who have dealt with Jigsaw firsthand. You see a lot of people from the previous films, like Saw 4, Saw 5, Saw 6. But they focus a lot on the Hoffman storyline and his dynamic with Jigsaw's wife and them threatening one another. And I felt like it was getting old at this point. They need to throw something new into the mix. And they have a little bit of people trying to hunt down Hoffman at this point because they're figuring out who he is. There's some good suspense here and there, but overall, there's just too much gore. There's a whole scene with I think it's like a rock band that gets, you know, they're racist. It's a rock band that plays the parts of these racists, and they have to, like, peel their skin off, and it's really gross. It's the most gross of all of the Saw movies. There's one scene in particular where there's a key in this woman's throat that has to be pulled out. It makes you, like, grit your teeth and cringe. And it's not, like, in the suspenseful way, like the earlier Saw movies made it. Like, are they gonna survive? It's more like, this is gross, I want to look away. Because there's not really anything else being offered. But at the end, of course, Hoffman gets his comeuppance, and he gets put in the original room from Saw 1 by Dr. Gordon, who got his leg fixed up by Jigsaw after the events of Saw 1, and Hoffman is left to die, and there could be a suspenseful sequel to this, but unfortunately, there was a huge gap between Saw 3D, which is Saw 7, and Jigsaw, and the reason is Paranormal Activity, essentially. Competition. Paranormal Activity was really popular, and just hit theaters and was captivating audiences. And for a series like Saw that came out like every October for Halloween time, Paranormal Activity putting itself into that, you know, especially with Blumhouse being up and coming at that time, took that away from Saw. So it took many years before Saw would return to the big screen with Jigsaw, which is the most well-shot, well-looking movie. I still like how Saw 1 is very grungy, so it's still my favorite looking of the series, but in terms of professionalism and colors and shot composition and stuff and depth of field and all that stuff, all that technical stuff, cinematography, it's the most competently well-shot one, but it lacks the grit and like the fast motion, the slow motion, and everything that you would expect in the Saw movies. And it's very polished, I feel, looking back on it. It's a good story. It's a group of people who have to put aside their differences to survive, and Jigsaw is back. Ooh, he's back, but it's actually, you know, because this movie takes place in the past, and he teaches all these people a lesson. There's a woman who killed her own baby. There's a petty thief that shot someone for like 20 cents or something, and there's a whole sequence about that. It's a good movie. There's a lot of great practical effects in the film. The ending with the laser collar I thought was really nice. With that said, though, when I watch some of the other Saw movies, you realize that Jigsaw takes a lot from those movies, and for that reason, it's not completely original. Still a good movie. I think like it gave a good polished overview, and it paid homage to the older Saw films. I'm glad it was in theaters, and I'm glad it was made because it reinvented Saw for maybe a more contemporary audience who wants something a little more sleek after all the Blumhouse movies. But I don't think it captures the same tone as Saw 1, Saw 2, 4, 5, 6, the ones that I think are the best. It probably goes after those ones, but, you know, it's still better than Saw 7 and Saw 3, definitely. And it's not a bad movie, and I liked it a lot when I first saw it, and I still really like it, and I still wouldn't mind watching it again, but the characters can be a little forgetful, and Jigsaw isn't in it for all that much, and you have to rely on this new guy who's been a part of it the whole time, but he wasn't as captivating to me as Hoffman, where I think Hoffman was a little more well-defined, and he was very bold in what he was trying to do. Which leads us up to Spiral with Sam L. Jackson in it, and I am very curious to see what happens in this film. It sounds like it's gonna maybe be part horror comedy, but I can't tell. I don't even know if it's in the same continuity, but, you know, the door is open to possibilities, because this is the Saw series, Saw universe, so who knows what will happen next. But you know what's one thing, looking at all these movies that's really crazy, is just how all of these were in theaters. You would think with a series like Saw, there would be direct-to-video movies being made, but it's not the case. Saw was always in theaters, always around Halloween time, and I respect that. Despite the criticisms of the later Saw movies, the original Saw is one of my favorite horror films, made by James Wan, one of my favorite horror directors, and I think that was his best movie. I think that's his best horror film. I really like the movie. It has thriller elements, it has that police vibe, and the psychological nature with Jigsaw, which is carried throughout the series. They get more gory and vary in quality, and quality not just of the film itself, but also the script and the writing that goes into it. But they're all enjoyable, and once you start watching them, you could like binge watch the entire series like a TV show, like a CSI Miami type, whatever show, with just a bigger emphasis on gore and more horror beats. But it's a great series. The Saw series, easily one of my favorite horror series. It's a very convoluted series if you try to map it all out chronologically, because there's a lot of retconning that goes on and a lot of intrusions from later films that didn't happen in the previous ones, so kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, looking at it all these years later in retrospect. But the series as a whole is really fun, and if you're looking to binge watch some movies for Halloween time, Saw is definitely a great option for you. Saw will live on, not just as a, what can happen when a powerful filmmaking duo makes a concept that gets spun off into an entire franchise. It's not just going to be significant in that sense, but also in terms of 2000s horror, it was probably the top horror series until Paranormal Activity stepped in, like I said. But great series, great movies, great first movie, many good sequels. I recommend the Saw series to all of you, and I thank you for joining me for this over-review of the Saw series. If you have another suggestion for more over-reviews that you want to see me do, leave them in the comments below. I'm planning on doing ones for the Chucky and the Halloween series coming soon, so stay tuned for that. And remember, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.